Every woman who's gotten an abortion should be retroactively charged with first-degree murder, as well as the doctors who procured them. But because we live in a satanic society, that's considered a controversial statement. All people who are pro-choice are blinded by Satan, but there's a few different types of people who are in favor of abortion for various different reasons, all of whom belong in forced labor camps. But let's quickly dismantle the most common positions. Firstly, you have the people who don't consider unborn children as human beings, or they have arbitrary starting points for when the unborn child becomes a human, whether it's when they can feel pain, when the heart starts beating, when they grow fingernails, all subjective, relative, silly goose nonsense that doesn't hold up against even minimal scrutiny. The Catholic position, which is of course the only correct position, is that life begins at conception, which is supported by biology because at the moment of conception, new human DNA separate from the mother and father is created, which also destroys the argument of my body, my choice, which is already an absurd argument in and of itself because your body is not yours, it belongs to God, and each of us has a moral obligation to treat our bodies as a temple of Christ, which is why it's immoral to kill or deform ourselves. So it's God's body, God's choice. And Christian men are the only ones with the cognitive ability to enforce God's law. But once conception occurs, it is no longer just your body anyway. You now have a separate human being developing inside of you, and the DNA of that child remains in you forever, whether the baby is aborted or miscarried or carried to full term. Then you have people who say, well, what about the cases of rape or incest? Even though most reported rapes aren't real, they're just regret or revenge, but either way, that's more of an argument in favor of why women shouldn't be allowed in public by themselves, not why they should be allowed to murder their child. And the rape thing is just a rhetorical trick these demons always use. They go to the most extreme circumstances and then use that to justify totality. Rape and incest account for less than 1% of all abortions. 99% of abortions are elective, meaning it's just women who want to kill their child because they couldn't keep their legs closed and don't want to accept responsibility for their slutty actions. And 50% of women who get an abortion had one in the past, and 25% of them had more than one, which means they're using it as a form of contraception, which is super gay and satanic. And people say the rape stuff is a gotcha question, but if you ask them, well, okay, so would you be in favor of only allowing abortion in those certain cases and criminalizing all other cases? They're almost always never going to agree to that. So they're already being disingenuous. But it's also irrelevant because even in those rare extreme cases, abortion is never justifiable because it's murder. And the taking of an innocent life is never acceptable, regardless of how that life came to be. Oh, so if an 11-year-old girl is raped, she should be forced to have that baby? Yes. And I have three daughters, but I would never allow my children around Indians, so I don't have to worry about that. And secondly, as traumatic of an event as that is for the girl, and that experience is horrific and will affect the rest of her life, of course, that doesn't diminish the dignity owed to the unborn child or negate their right to life, which again boils down to whether or not you believe an unborn child is a human being or not. Because if you do, then it shouldn't even be a debate, regardless of the emotional hypotheticals people like to throw around. And if you don't believe an unborn child is a human being, you're wrong and shouldn't be allowed to publicly express your demonic opinions in public. But what about when there's complications in a pregnancy and a mother's life is in jeopardy? Well, in those rare cases, there's a difference between inducing early labor and the abortion procedure of injecting the baby with a chemical to kill them or ripping them apart limb from limb. The goal should always be an attempt to preserve the life of both mother and child, not put a higher importance on one life over the other. An abortion is never medically necessary, ever. Treatment for ectopic pregnancies, on the other hand, which often get conflated with abortions but are not, is allowed in certain circumstances when both lives can't be saved. Ectopic pregnancies are when the embryo is formed outside of the uterus and cannot survive, and if left inside, will kill the mother because it can rupture the fallopian tube, causing severe internal bleeding or some woman nonsense. But because of the Catholic principle of double effect, treating an ectopic pregnancy when both lives cannot be saved after all other options have been exhausted is acceptable because you are trying to save the woman's life with the unintended effect of ending the unborn child's life who has no chance of survival in the first place. But that's also only in rare circumstances, and a lot of ectopic pregnancies can be salvaged and both lives can be saved, especially with modern technological advances. And then you have the people who conflate treatment of miscarriages as abortion and use extreme cases where a baby is miscarried and removing the deceased embryo is needed to save the life, and the doctor refuses to do so because the state laws don't allow abortion. Which, in those extraordinarily rare events, it does happen occasionally, but the blame is completely on the doctor and the healthcare provider, as there is no law preventing treatment of a miscarried child whose embryo is still in the woman's body. An abortion is purposely killing the child, not removing an already deceased child from a woman's body. But anyway, abortion is evil in every circumstance, and it's essentially satanic child sacrifice, which mocks the sacrifice of Christ, glorifying murder and brainwashing women into thinking it's an act of freedom or even healthcare, and it's a result of humanity's separation from the church and things like the sexual revolution, which trivialized sex, separating it from the marital act. So not only should abortion be completely illegal, but so should contraceptives, birth control, IVF, which is arguably worse than abortion, and all forms of premarital sex. This is just another result of women's suffrage and civil rights, where women have misused their bodily autonomy to become promiscuous child murderers, and a radical societal correction is needed to put women back in their proper place.